So today I'll be discussing Hopkins' use of images of energy, such as metaphors of light, fire and heat, to explore religious and existential faith and doubt. This type of imagery is obviously not unique to Hopkins. It's well embedded in common idiom. So for example, one sees the light or has a dark night of the soul, you can have a sunny disposition or black moods. God is frequently described as light or likened to fire in the Bible, and it seems natural to us to associate light with happiness and darkness with despair. Warmth and cold are often associated with affection and loneliness, life and death, or nourishment and starvation. These tropes took on new significance in the 19th century, though, where new discoveries in the field of energy physics, which is to say the study of how the energy around us, like heat, light and sound, work. These developments suggested that the universe was slowly decaying and eternal existence was scientifically unviable, threatening the comfort offered by the prospect of an eternity with God in the afterlife. The new vocabulary and figurative possibilities offered by this branch of energy science lent themselves well to poetry of existential and religious crisis. Naturally, the notions that the Victorians lived in a dying universe with limited hope for a life after death caused some consternation. However, it also captured the imagination of many poets, including Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, and of course, Jeremiah Hopkins. Poetry offered the possibility for a kind of double processing of anxiety, personal and universal. For this reason, poetry was an important medium for dealing with and suggesting solutions to the troubling implications of these scientific discoveries. Hopkins was clearly engaged with contemporary scientific developments. He wrote several letters to the scientific journal Nature, and disagreed so strongly with the scientific philosophy of one particular scientific treatise, Light, by Peter Guthrie Tait, that he intended to write a rebutting study of light and ether, which depended less upon principles of scientific materialism. The close attention to detail, to the colours and forms of things that makes Hopkins' poetry so vivid, suggests a flair for observation that tends to the scientific. Thus, it's not surprising that thermodynamics attracted Hopkins' attention, and that it's possible to make illuminating energy readings of many of his poems. During this talk, I'm first going to explain a little bit about what the laws of thermodynamics actually are, and what they meant to the Victorians, and why they might have mattered to Jeremiah Hopkins. Then I'm going to apply this to Hopkins' poetry and look at three of his sonnets with contrasting depictions of energy and entropy to consider some of the solutions he suggests for the problem of a finite and potentially dying universe. So, first, what are the laws of thermodynamics? They were both formulated in the 19th century and they still stand today. I'll explain what they meant for the Victorians and why Hopkins might have been so worried about them. Energy physics saw a lot of development during the 19th century, and in 1856, the German physicist Rudolf Clausius set forth the first two laws of thermodynamics thus. 1. The energy of the universe is constant, and 2. The entropy of the universe tends towards maximum. So, the first law states that the total amount of energy in the universe won't ever change. It will never run out of energy. But new energy can't be created or come in from outside. However, the second law qualifies the idea that we'll always have the same amount of energy, because not all energy is equal. Entropy is the amount of energy in a system, in this case the universe, that's not useful. Because entropy tends towards maximum, any energy used will always eventually convert to less useful forms, to forms that don't do what we want them to do. Therefore, in any system, a portion of the energy in it will be converted to a type of energy that can't be recovered or used again. A simple example of this can be seen in the spinning bicycle wheel, which I've kind of illustrated there. After the wheel has been pushed, it will rotate a few times before eventually slowing to a halt once more. There's the same amount of energy in the universe after the wheel has been spun as before, as the first law states, but the energy has been redistributed in accordance to the second law. Friction and air resistance work against the wheel moving, and the kinetic energy that's sending the wheel around is gradually converted into heat and sound energy. You can hear it whirring, and like the axle warms up. And that energy is not energy that we want. We just want the energy to keep the bicycle wheel turning. This waste energy cannot be easily recovered or turned into a form that would allow the wheel to keep spinning, so eventually it slows to a stop. These same laws apply to the universe, but the model is slightly different. A bike wheel is a closed system, which despite its name means that energy can be put in and go out when the wheel stops turning, but someone can put more energy into it by giving it a push and spinning it around again. But the universe is an isolated system, and the law says the amount of energy in it is constant. No new energy can go in and none can go out. No one can give the universe a push. Ultimately, mid-Victorian scientists concluded that the laws of thermodynamics meant the stars would eventually burn themselves out, and the processes which keep everything moving would sooner or later succumb to the second law. The universe would run down into motionlessness and uniformity, a process called heat death. The laws of thermodynamics also raise theological questions. For Christians, God is eternal, and so is the afterlife. But to exist is presumably to use energy. So eternal existence violates the second law of thermodynamics. Therefore, developments in the science of energy introduced a number of new problems to Victorian ideas about God and the afterlife. Victorians were quite familiar with the worry that the sun might eventually burn itself out. However, the possibility that it and the universe as a whole would cool and die was given new urgency with these laws. The timescale involved was unknown, and the likelihood of such an event was now backed with alarming scientific authority. Further, many Victorians were comforted by the prospect of an eternal heaven that awaited them after death, regardless of whether or not the physical universe might eventually die. But now, they were forced to consider the possibility that an eternal afterlife ran counter to the laws of thermodynamics, and thus not just this world, but the next was threatened by the spectre of entropy. There were two main ways that the Victorians attempted to quell the theological and existential anxieties that thermodynamics raised. The first was to suggest that the universe was not an isolated system, but a closed one, like the bike wheel. Much as a person can put more energy into the wheel by spinning it to keep it rotating, God could give our universe a push when it seems to be running down. This is a fine solution in the short term, but seems to just delay the problem. Even if the universe exists in a bigger system from which God can transfer energy to us, that system, or the system the next level up from it, and so on, we must eventually get to an isolated system, and we're back to the issue of finite energy posed by the first law. The other is simply to distinguish between spiritual divine energy and spiritual and physical energy. The reasoning goes basically that God is perfect, so God's energy must be perfect, and energy systems as described by the laws of thermodynamics are imperfect, so God's energy must be outside of those laws. Plus, God as creator must have made the laws of thermodynamics, and so must have worked outside of them at some point to create them in the first place. So with that distinction, the physical universe, the stars and the planets and galaxies will be subject to entropy and will eventually fall still. But God, the afterlife, and the human soul are all divine, eternal energy, and will thus endure. However, again, that didn't satisfy everyone. Certain groups, particularly some religious scientists, wanted to have a unified model in which scientific laws and God could be considered together without conflict or divide. To simply say the divine is eternal because God is God was, to these people, a bit of a cop-out. This second approach, distinguishing between divine and natural energy, though, is broadly the attitude that Hopkins took to the issue of thermodynamics. As well as new problems, the laws of thermodynamics and the angst they provoked provided new vocabulary and metaphors for writers, and for poets in particular. By considering the ultimate, greatest of all tragedies, the end of the universe, poets were able to navigate and process smaller griefs and anxieties. Conversely, they could utilise contemporary ideals, such as empire or capitalism, as a basis for proposed solutions to the problem of energy scarcity. So before I talk about Hopkins' poems, I just want to give you a quick example of a solution which is the opposite to his, so one that makes a closed system, that makes the universe a closed system. It was a very popular scientific treatise at the time called The Unseen Universe, written by the physicists Balfour Stewart and Peter Guthrie Tait in 1875. Stewart and Tait were both devout Christians and physicists, and both wrote science texts for the general public. Peter Guthrie Tait it's the same Tait that so moved Hopkins that he wanted to write his own scientific treatise about light. The Unseen Universe enjoyed significant popularity due to its persuasive and comforting approach to reconciling thermodynamics and religion in one easy-to-digest system. They suggested that although there was a divide between the scientifically recordable and the divine, the seen and the unseen, the distinction wasn't necessarily one of types of energy. Rather, they suggest that the unseen universe, which houses God and an eternal afterlife, operates as a kind of parallel dimension, and that energy was able to flow between the two. They suggest that rather than just becoming unrecoverable, the waste energy that we lose to entropy simply goes elsewhere. they propose that it moves over a bridge of ether. Ether was a kind of Victorian version of dark matter, to the unseen universe, with the seen and the unseen universe helping to power the other, each helping to power the other. While Stewart and Tate are ambivalent about the survival of the invisible universe in the long term, they're certain of an eternal God and afterlife. One of the types of energy that makes it across the bridge of ether to the seen and the unseen is the human soul, thus guaranteeing the afterlife that Victorians expected and hoped for. Despite their claims to the contrary, Stewart and Tate bend or break the second law of thermodynamics repeatedly throughout the book, but they certainly do it creatively and ultimately very reassuringly. Their version of a universe complete with an allegedly thermodynamically viable afterlife was of great comfort to many Victorians. Readers of the unseen universe could relax in the knowledge that although the exact mechanics might be more complicated and involve more ether than they might have expected, ultimately the status quo of an indefinite universe and an eternal afterlife was preserved. So we've looked at the science and we've looked at what the thermodynamics meant to the Victorians. So let's talk about Hopkins' poetry. I'm going to look at 3 poems which I think represent a spectrum of emotions and attitudes towards thermodynamics and its possibilities to Hopkins. And we'll start with the one that lays out the conclusion that Hopkins comes to the most frequently and the one that lays out the most clearly. I'm going to address these poems in reverse chronological order. I'm going to begin with the one he wrote last, and that presents the most nuanced attitude to thermodynamic anxieties. Then go backwards to one of his terrible sonnets, and end with the earliest and most optimistic of the 3. For Hopkins, the way out of an entropic universe is simple. It's faith. One way in which Hopkins expresses his conviction that God would ultimately provide a solution to thermodynamic catastrophe can be seen in his 1888 sonnet, that nature is a Heraclitean fire, and on the comfort of the resurrection. In this poem, Hopkins draws a clear divide between natural energy, created by God but functioning within normal physical rules, and divine energy, which is more closely related to God himself, and as such is above and beyond normal laws. So I hope you'll indulge me, and I'm going to read it aloud, okay? Cloud puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows flaunt forth, then Chevy on an air-built thoroughfare. Heaven roisterers in gay gangs, they throng their glittering marches. Down rough cast, down dazzling whitewash, wherever an elm arches, shive lights and shadow tackle in long lashes, lace, lance and hair. Delightfully the bright wind boisterous, ropes, wrestles, beats earth bare of yester-tempest creases. In pool and rock hill parches, squandering ooze to squeeze dough, crust, dust, stanches, starches, squadron masts and man marks, tread my toil their foot fretted in it. Million fueled, nature's bonfire but burns on. But quench her bonniest, dearest to her clearest selved spark, man, how fast is fired in, his mark on mind is gone. Both are in an unfathomable, all is in an enormous dark, drowned. With pity and indignation, man-shape that shone sheer off, disseveral, a star, death blots blackout, nor mark is any of him at all so stark, but fastens, blurs, and time beats level. Enough. The resurrection, a heart's clarion, away grief's gasping, joyless days, dejection, across my foundering deck shone a beacon, an eternal beam. Flesh fades and mortal trash fall to the residuary worm. World's wildfire leave but ash. In a flash, as a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. And this jack, joke, poor pot shard, patch, matchwood, immortal diamond is a mortal diamond. This poem provides a useful insight into Hopkins' construction of the relationship between energies and God. The poem is split into 2 parts, each of which describes a related but contrasting worldview. The first, that nature is Heraclitean fire, uses the Greek philosopher Heraclitus' idea that the ordered world, the same for all, no god or man-made, but always was, is, and will be, an ever-living fire, being kindled in measures and being put out in measures. The second, of the comfort of the resurrection, describes humanity's fortune as at Judgment Day, as their nature, being all at once what Christ is, exempts them from the vagaries of nature, as described in the first part, and grants them immortality in God's divine light. Heraclitus' conception of the world saw fire as the most important of the classical elements, comprising the basic material of the world. Much of his work describes the way in which fire works, both with the other elements and in its role as base stuff. Fragment 30 in particular quoted above, captures the integral role which Heraclitus assigned fire, and shows many of the qualities which that nature uses in describing the natural world in the first part of the poem. The fragment identifies all of creation as an eternal fire, similar to Hopkins' idea of sustaining eternal light. However, there are two key differences between Heraclitus' fire and Hopkins' eternal light. First and foremost, their sources are different. Fire is natural, while the light is decidedly divine. Second, while the fire flickers, the light is steady. The first part of the poem, to halfway through line 16, enough, gives a rousing, energetic, in all senses of the word, description of the natural world according to Heraclitean philosophy. Because of all things invariably change and transmute within the cycle of Heraclitean fire, humans also ultimately die. Their fire din is gone, and they're quickly folded back into the ever-living fire. At first glance, this idea is not compatible with thermodynamics, relying as it does on a universe that always it was and is. However, it does resonate with the Victorian thermodynamic concern that eventually the cosmos might become uniform, all energy converted into inaccessible forms. Similar anxieties are reflected powerfully in the first part of Hopkins' poem, but vastness blurs and time beats level. After this worldview is established, Hopkins abruptly brings it to a halt to commence the second part of the poem, which describes the comfort of the resurrection. In this part, the idea of fire and eternal energy continues, but it's not mindless and cyclical as Heraclitus describes. Here, energy is divine rather than just a fact of the universe. It removes mankind from Heraclitus' inexorable fire, allowing part of them, presumably their souls, to live on regardless. Fire, heat, and light are a trope of energy, which Hopkins often exploits, and fire in particular is a clear and indeed eponymous focus in that nature is a Heraclitean fire. Hopkins establishes an important distinction between two types of energy. There's natural energy, created by but not of God, which conforms to natural, potentially problematic scientific laws. And there's divine energy, which bypasses the laws to which other forms are subject. The difference is established from the very title, where nature and the resurrection, a clear reference to the spiritual, are set as two decidedly distinct ideas. That nature is a Heraclitean fire is in sprung rhythm and a changeable hexameter. It moves between trochaic-ish shive lights and shadow tackle in long, iambic-ish, like da-dum, da-dum, dum-dum, and dactylic-ish, down rough cast, down dazzling, whitewash, but these shards are so small because it's never for more than a few beats before it changes to a different meter. And it's complicated by the accentual nature of sprung rhythm. This complex meter, with periods of multiple accented or unaccented syllables altogether, lends an inexorable rolling sense to the poem. The enduring, ever-shifting nature of the Heraclitean fire is reflected in the repeated use of several similar-sounding words together. You've got lashes, lace, lance, and stanches, starches. Each word slightly changes from the last to show the constantly shifting nature of eternal fire according to Heraclitus. The internal rhyme and assonance which runs throughout the poem also adds to this kind of fire-like effect. Though each word seems to stem from or allude to another in sound, rhyme, or meaning. This relatedness is a kind of verbal demonstration of the way Heraclitean fire moves from one state to another, each state or word related to but separate to the next. The first sentence in particular establishes a flowing, unrelenting rhythm. It reinforced by enjambment through a hyphenated word. Cloud puffball, torn tusk, pillows flaunt forth in chevion, and air hyphen built thoroughfare. The natural world goes on, ever changing but unceasing, regardless of what else is happening. The earlier part of the poem is well punctuated, but all of the sentences are long, shifting and flowing, and there's almost no really substantial pauses. This series of lengthy sentences comes to an end with those two extreme exclaimed caesuras between the first and second sections. Enough, the resurrection, a heart's clarion. This set of short, sharp sentences puts a strong contrast as possible between the two sections of the poem. The interruption, the enough, happens midway through a line, emphasising the strength of the new idea Hopkins is about to introduce. It's so powerful that the poem has to cut itself off and change direction mid-flow. Along with the changing structure of the sentences, moving from long and flowing at the beginning to short and sharp at the volta, the poem's point also closes in and moves down. It begins with a panoramic view of clouds. then brings the view down to the tree line, repeating the word down twice in doing so, and again down to the earth itself. Although the poem's view then seems to kind of move back up to the people walking on the earth, the idea of earth, of pressure and of heat below underground clearly remains planted in the poem. The imagery, underground imagery, re-emerges transformed at the end of the comfort section as a metaphor of the saved and soon-to-be resurrected soul, immortal diamond. The repetition of this image over two lines, immortal diamond, is a real example of the change in flow, pace and rhyme, which occurs between the two parts of the poem. Whereas in the first half there was constant flux, the second is stable, reflecting the constancy of the divine. The repetition reinforces this idea. Any word repeated in the first part of the poem is transmuted, whereas here, under the eternal beam of God's power, the immortal diamond is protected and exempt from the chaos of constant change. Light, fire, and fiery imagery are inescapable. At the Volta, where death blots blackout, the nature of fire and light changes, as the temperamental fire of the natural world is replaced by the steady beam of divine light. In the first part, light is tumultuous and constantly changing, shy of lights and shadow tackle, in long lashes, lace, lance and pear, reinforcing the sense of movement present throughout the Heraclitean fire section. In addition to its kinetics, the light is also intermittent. By the end of the section, light is disappeared altogether, blotted out by death. Likewise, fire takes the shape only as sparks, inevitably snuffed out too soon. The second part, however, characterises light very differently. Whereas in the first part, light and earth are linked, the image of one flowing from and into the other. In the second, it's isolated from anything earthly, it's pure, consistent and divine. The reason for this is that light and fire of the first part are natural, but in the second is divine. Light here is a beacon, an eternal beam, preventing man from drowning in an enormous dark, i.e. death, and being thus permanently quenched. In many ways, it exemplifies some of Hopkins' attempts to reconcile the laws of the natural world with the teachings of his religion. The second law seems to question the possibility of an eternal, all-powerful God, and he suggested a literal and metaphorical dark far future in which cosmos winds down into uniformity. Hopkins' solution here is to separate the two, exempting God and by extension the immortal part of humanity from the harsh laws of the rest of nature. The natural world, while vivid, exhilarating and rather beautiful, is also chaotic and without clear direction. It's the description of the divine part of humanity's makeup, that which may be lit by the eternal beam of God's divine light, which gives the poem its stability, eventually grounding in an image which combines the distinctly earthly with the unquestionably divine. It's essentially a reassuring poem, replete with light and fire and the certain of eternity. However, it doesn't offer the soothing, relatively simple comfort of, for example, the unseen universe, which we talked about earlier, whose solution to the problem of thermodynamics we've just discussed, or God's grandeur, which I'll be discussing in a few minutes. The poem, for all its hopeful message, is a challenging read. It's rumbustious and spikily innovative, off-putting and overwhelming in its exuberance. The eponymous comfort offered by the poem is not necessarily an emollient one. That nature is a Heraclitean fire is fairly typical of Hopkins' approach to questions of faith and nature. He consistently creates a distinction between the natural and divine, and characterises the divine with energy imagery. A poem which he wrote which contrasts considerably to the careful optimism and religious hope in that nature is a Heraclitean fire is his sonnet Spark from Sybil's Leaves. Written in 1885, 3 years earlier than Heraclitean fire, Sybil's Leaves is one of the so-called terrible sonnets, written during Hopkins' own Dark Night of the Soul. It's Hopkins' only poem dealing with themes of energy, entropy, and apocalypse, which offers no hope of eternity or eternal energy to lighten the prospect of entropy. Significantly, it's also one of very few poems that considers energy without ever mentioning God or the divine. In most of Hopkins' poems of doubt, there's the worry about the speaker's relationship with or concerns about God brings God into the poem. Even if he's saying he can't feel God's presence at all, he's still thinking of God, and thus there's the possibility that there'll be a renewed religious presence and faith. No such possibility is discussed plainly in Sybil's Leaves. Earth and humanity are alone in the universe to come to terms with their fate. Hopkins offers no real solutions, but rather simply demonstrates the importance of having a way to reconcile the contradictions between God and thermodynamics. Without such a strategy, in Hopkins' poetry at least, the world becomes very bleak. And I'm going to read this one aloud as well. Hopkins said this is to be half sung. I'll do my best. Earnest, earthless, equal, attunable, vaulty, voluminous, stupendous evening strains to be time's vast, womb of all, home of all, hearse of all, night. Her fond yellow horn light wound to the west, her wild yellow hollow hall light hung to the height waste, her earliest stars, stars principal overbend us, fire featuring heaven. For earth her being as unbound, her dapple was at an end, a stray or a swarm, all through the in throngs, self in self steeped and pashed, quite dismembering all now. Heart, you round me right with, our evening is over us, our night whelms and will end us. Only the beak-leaved boughs, dragonish, damask the smooth, tall smooth, bleak light, black, ever so black on it. Our tale, oh, our oracle, let life let life wind off her once skein-stained, veined variety on two spools, part pen, pack, now all in two flocks, two folds, black, white, right, wrong, reckon but, wreck but, mind but, these two, where a world where but these two tell, each off the other, of a rack where, self-wrung, self-strung, sheathed and shelterless, thoughts against thoughts in groans grind. Spelt from Sybil's Leaves explores the results of the earth being as unbound, succumbing to entropy, and the uniformity which comes with this development. The poem explores the repercussions of an entropic world, presenting a kind of worst-case scenario. Although there's none of the naked despair that one might find in other of his poems, such as Carrion Comfort or Tennyson's In Memoriam, the world presented in Sybil's Leaves is a dismal one, perhaps all the more effective at communicating the bleakness of an entropic future for the lack of an explicitly named or described emotion. Although Hopkins stipulated that the poem was written to be read aloud and that he hoped the poem would be half sung, the punctuation defies steady or easy recitation. Only one line has fewer than 2 punctuation marks, and most are filled with commas and other caesuras. The excess of punctuation and pauses, as well as the very long lines, an average of 10 feet per line, so a kind of double-length sonnet, means the reader becomes bogged down in the individual words. It makes it harder to get a sense of the larger scheme of the poem. The reader instead has to fight, to expend their own energy, mentally and rhetorically, to impose sense and order on the lines. The list of similar sounding words are reminiscent of those in Heraclity and Fire. Long lashes, lace, lance, and pear, compared to self-wrung, self-strung, sheathed, and shelterless, but to quite different effect. In that nature, the alliteration and assonance is energetic and joyful, imitating an eternal God-sustained fire. The same devices in Sybil's Leaves instead evoke the shapelessness and uniformity of entropy's final result. Similarly, the use of repetition, which in the closing lines of Heraclity and Fire are an indication of steadiness and certainty imparted by religious faith, has instead an unsteadying effect in Sybil's Leaves. The rhyme scheme too speaks of stasis. The first 8 lines describing an evening scene seems to progress with 3 rhyming couplets, but the 8th and final line rhymes with the first, stupendous and will end us. The reader ends up back where they started, despite the movement forward that changing rhyme seems to give. The sestet 2, with its A-B scheme, is constantly pulling the rhyme back. Every movement towards the B rhyme is countered in the next line by a return to A, and the settled repetitive scheme reflects the unchanging nature of a future world with maximum entropy. Light and other energy tropes are dwarfed here, which is perhaps to be expected with the total absence of God from the poem. After the enormous majesty and relatively lengthy description of room of all, house of all, home of all, night, the sun and moon described on the next line are trivial and lifeless. The sun is a fond yellow horn light, and the moon a wild hollow horn light, and both are objects belonging to a personified light. Light here has none of the power, motion, and divine strength lent to it in that nature is Heraclity and Fire, or in the next poem I will discuss. In Spelt from Sybil's Leaves, darkness and entropy have won out. So to end on an optimistic note, after the doom of Sybil's Leaves, a far more hopeful and confident view of energy can be found in 1877 sonnet God's Grandeur. This is the earliest of the 3 poems, and as such it's possibly not surprising that it's the most simplistically optimistic poem. Like in that Heraclity and Fire, the basic reason for the thermodynamic confidence in God's grandeur is that the speaker trusts in God. However, the faith in this poem goes a step further. Heraclitean fire separates natural and divine energy, thereby admitting that natural energy is at the mercy of the laws of thermodynamics. But God's grandeur makes no such distinction. Natural energy is divine energy, and so will always endure. And I'm going to give this a read as well. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, smeared with bleed, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things, and though the last lights of the black west went, O morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. Unlike the other two poems, which both begin with natural scenes, here the first and last image of the poem is firmly centred around God, beginning and ending with active images of God or God's power working on earth. Both the opening and closing lines, the world is charged with the grandeur of God, and the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods, are energy lines showing two different kinds of divine power. The opening is an active, bright image, almost charging the poem itself with energy, as the light of God flashes forth in the poem, while the final lines depict a softer, more comforting energy. Much as the introduction of God to Heraclitean fire begins to assert stability on the rhythm and rhyme in the poem, God's grandeur is very metrically stable. It's the most traditional of the three sonnets examined here, following one of the conventional rhyming schemes and largely conforming to the usual sonnet meter. This familiarity adds a further layer of comfort to the poem. You know where you stand with this kind of sonnet. The regularity of the poem, combined with the explicit presence of God within it, underscores again the message of reassurance. Divine energy will keep the world spinning and the soil producing, despite the worries of humanity. Although there's a moment of concern in the second half of the octave, the poem is a kind of faith sandwich, opening and closing with expressions of joyous and unwavering religious devotion. Indeed, the doubt in the middle lines are not about God failing humanity, but humanity failing itself. In the doubting quintet, separation from God and nature are equated. Its first line asks, why do men then now not wreck his rod? Or why doesn't humanity pay heed to God's will? The explanation of the question makes it clear that God's will is to work with and not against nature. The only hint of weariness in this poem is the trudging repetition of have trod. Humanity is tired out by its own work, which takes it away from its connection with nature and thus God. Humanity renders the soil bare, and we separate ourselves from it spiritually and physically. However, even this error on humanity's part is easily fixed with faith, and the reader is reassured by the end that despite humanity's foolishness, a benevolent and parental God watches over us. God's grandeur is characterised above all by certainty and hope. It is the only one of the three poems here which uses the future tense. The grandeur of God will flame out. This tense suggests the certainty of an earthly future which is totally absent in Sybil's leaves and ambivalent even in Heraclitean fire. Divine energy charges even darkness in God's grandeur. Dark, deep soil nurtures the dearest freshness, and the last lights of the black west is simply the cue for a new sunrise to begin in a few hours. That nature is Heraclitean fire and the comfort of the resurrection, spelt from Sybil's leaves, and God's grandeur form a spectrum which showcases Hopkins' estimation of the effect of God's presence on the humanity and the natural world. God's grandeur, the most energetically confident of the poems, allows all of nature to be imbued with divine energy. As such, it focuses only on the energy that God provides, certain that nature is never spent as long as the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods. Spelt from Sybil's leaves shows the dreadful possibilities of entropic eventuality, absent of God or divine energy. That nature is Heraclitean fire and the comfort of the resurrection strikes a balance between the two by forming a distinction between natural and divine energy. This division allows the cosmos to succumb to literal darkness from solar death and the other necessary tragedies of the laws of thermodynamics, but permits humanity exception from these laws as they are touched by a type of energy above and beyond mere nature. Thank you.
Dave, thank you very much. That was how should I say, we'll all have to go back to our books and reread these poems and see them in a new light.
Not to make a pun.
Not to make a pun on this. Thank you for all the work. The only kind of thing was that the one that was simplest, I think, was the one you wrote in Glasgow. Is that right? The God's Grandeur. And we have some young students here today, so we don't see much science in poetry, and there is an opportunity there. And how science was, Hopkins was very much attuned to science and was able to bring it into his poetry. So literature and science fertilising, nurturing each other. If we have any questions now for Niamh, now is your moment.
Michael, could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I'm from the scientific world myself.
Oh, great.
And I just wondered, and I should say, I've had nothing to do with Hopkins ever on a professional level, and nothing to do with English literature. But was Hopkins familiar with Charles Darwin's Origin of Species?
Yeah.
Did he worry about it in the same way as a contravention of the divine inspiration of the world?
There was an amount of concern, but to be honest, I've not read his poetry in relation to Darwin in the same way that I read it in relation to thermodynamics, but I'm sure you could interpret and read it that way.
But he was aware of Darwin?
He was aware of it. And
evolution and so on?
Yeah. He knew about it, that's certainly.
Sorry, this is a general point.
Yeah.
I don't think the Roman Catholic Church was as alarmed by Darwin as were the entire Protestant spectrum, including the Church of England. And there is a famous statement by Newman, who would, of course, have a terrific influence on Hopkins, who said, I think in a letter, I could go the whole hog with Darwin, because it made no difference to Newman whether God intervened, as it were, directly to mould man and insert a soul, or whether the soul grew within the evolving human being. I think that was the point, because the tendency in the Catholic Church was less to read the Bible with a fundamentalist literalism, and therefore they could read it more freely. And certainly Newman was not troubled by Darwin, and I suspect Hopkins would not have been either, but I don't have any specific information on that, and perhaps some people here would have more information.
His main problem seemed to have been entropy and the tendency towards disorder. But in fact, what poses most threat for mankind today is enthalpy, because combustion of hydrocarbon fuels is rapidly warming the planet. So it was the delta H rather than the delta S which we worried him.
I was going to say, actually, I'm sure I'm not alone in the feeling, and I think you yourself feel more comfortable with God's grandeur, you know. I begin to get a little alienated from Hopkins when you become extremely conscious of the repetitive, heavy alliteration and wordplay. And similarly, that happens sometimes when I'm reading Joyce. I think a poet or a writer can have a dangerous infatuation with the word, and I think Hopkins sometimes has it. And I mean, if you take God's grandeur, there are lines in that which are very, very simple. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. I mean, that could have been written by Matthew Arnold. You know, there's nothing supremely convoluted or inventive about it. But in a way, I suppose I'm more comforted, or more inclined to accept, as typical of Hopkins, the view expressed in God's grandeur. And I wonder if, to come back to Heraclitean fire, I wonder if we should read this. There are two ways, I think, of reading it. One is to say, the world is, what was the title again? That the world is Heraclitean fire. And to say, the world is Heraclitean fire, but the resurrection offers consolation. Or is Hopkins saying, you did use the word hypothetical, I think, about Sybil's leaves. is Hopkins saying in Herculean Fire, is he saying, even if the world were as Heraclitus thought it was, there would still be comfort in the resurrection? You know, I just find it, I find it almost in the two poems you singled out to begin with, there's almost a drift in Hopkins there towards Manichaeism. You know, at the dark light, as if when the world goes dark, God is gone.
Yeah. And
you very rightly pointed out that in God's grandeur, even when darkness comes, God is still there.
Yeah.
You know. So it perplexes me, but it's made me think, which is terrific, about poems that you can easily bypass or not give paid due attention to. You know?
Yeah. Yes. Really interesting points. I think what you were saying about his infatuation with the word. I think his instruction in Sybil's Leaves to read it half sung, because to me that repetition and alliteration is almost more musical. Like when I read them aloud, I often read them aloud to music because it makes it so much easier to follow and to kind of get a sense of the poem if you're not thinking of it as a metrical, like verbal thing, but as something that flows like music, which is what made me think of that comment. And that's hard. That's not as rewarding endeavour in God's Grandeur because it is so much more a poem than music. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, you made the point. It's much more traditional sonnet.
Yeah.
And the reader is not as challenged by it, feels comfortable with it, I think was the phrase, yeah.
I just want to add in there, I've actually done a number of the poems with jazz, with a very great jazz pianist, and Stan Tracy, if anybody knows the name. He died a few years ago, sadly. And Spelled from Sybil's Leaves absolutely works like it was written for jazz.
Yeah.
You know, it was improvised, so we were both sort of working off each other. And the thing you pointed out, the changes of rhythm and meter, certainly for me as a reader, made it made me work. And to make that sharp change in the middle of a poem is exciting. It's difficult, you have to get the pace right.
Yeah.
But tremendously exciting to do. So you're absolutely right there.
And I read it to electronic dance music rather than jazz, but I can definitely see it working for jazz. So.
Oh yes.
I would think it is the business of poetry to be infatuated with words.
Yeah, definitely.
And you know, unless everything is just an easy statement of faith, then it's going to show wrestling and suffering and doubt, and I think that's what Heraclean Fire does. And the metrical torturing, if you like, of the language, it has a function in that death blots black out as a function of saying this is everything gone.
Yeah.
And then you have immortal diamond is immortal diamond, and it allows the emphasis to fall on the is. So I think to my mind, it's obviously very different from God's Grandeur, but it's no less a poem. In fact, for me, it's a much greater poem because of that wrestling that's incorporated into the language, which I would think, forgetting the theology or the philosophy, is the business of poetry.
I would definitely agree with that. Personally speaking of those three poems, the Heraclean Fire is my favourite, and my favourite to read aloud, precisely because of that, the kind of the metrical challenges like you were talking about as well. So I would definitely agree with that point.
Would you say that maybe he wrote this poem more as a scientist than as a believer? Like God's Grandeur is maybe more of a...
It's an interesting... I think... to me, I think he's always writing as both, and maybe makes kind of a choice to not thinking about the science when he's writing about God's grandeur rather than the other way around, rather than bring the science in. Personally, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've read a lot of things about how Hopkins' approach to language was very scientific, and certain words that he chooses, he has chosen with almost scientific exactitude.
Yeah.
So I guess, would you say that maybe when he's more doubtful, more perturbed by the possibilities of science or the prospects of science, he would write more complicated poems?
Yeah, I think that would certainly make sense, and that kind of comes into there's a critical Kirsty Blair who writes that when people are writing about a religious faith, they write kind of simple, straightforward meters like the dum, the dum, the dum, and when they're talking about religious doubt, they use more complicated and more perturbed meters. I think that could certainly be extended to the kind of language that he uses and that Hopkins uses in Heredity and Flow.
Thanks very much, Neil. Any more questions?
Well, could I just put a footnote and add to what I said, which is, we know that Hopkins was a great admirer of George Herbert. We know that Herbert was a great admirer of simplicity. So that, I just want to stir the pot.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, in fact, he says in one of his poems, I think he means this as both stylistic and religious, give me simplicity that I may live. That's Herbert. And he was compelled to be simple and unlearned, as we know. When he went to that country parish, he was a very educated man. He had to give sermons, and the sermons had to be communicated in simple language. So I take Richard's point. That was Richard who was talking.
Paddy.
Beg your pardon, yeah. I take Paddy's point, but I think that there are moments in a text when a poet cannot make a simple statement. He has to earn the right to make the simple statement. But he works his way through a complexity of utterance in order to arrive at a simple statement. The end of the famous Philip Larkin poem about love. What is that line? I can't remember it.
What will remain of us is love.
What will remain of us is love. That's a very simple statement. But you know, Larkin has to earn the right to say that. So that's why I'm not at all banning complexity.
Yeah.
God forbid, but I'd be out of a job. But I mean, you know, you look for a clarion call sometimes that rises above the jazz. You know, there comes a pure note, and you say,
Yeah.
you know, so.
Well, you have to earn the right to be simple through the complexity.
Yes.
You have to work
That's
through
right, I agree.
all
I
the
agree.
stuff to arrive at the simple statement.
To earn it, yes, yeah.
I'm a poet and it's not true.
I always
Oh,
start.
I think I see an argument arising.
That's a good point to start from.
Thank you, Niamh. I remember somebody actually reading Spelt from Civil Leaves as a rap. So maybe sometime later today somebody will do Spelt as a rap. Maybe
Any jazz musicians?
younger people might try to do that. It's time now for